Hi, I'm Michelle Ritter, and this is my mother, Carolee Fairbanks, and we are going to be discussing our family genealogy as it relates to Kansas Voices History Project. And first of all, Mom, I just wanted to say that when I was a little girl, I remember sitting at Grandma and Grandpa's house at Christmas, and the adults would be in the kitchen eating some pickled herring, having some eggnog, and listening to some Swedish Christmas music. And what was his name?
Yogi Jorgensen. That
Yes.
was my dad's very favorite Christmas song. It was just a silly, silly song. It's called I Just Go Nuts at Christmas.
And it was hilarious. And all of us cousins thought it was very, very funny. But it was really neat that we still had that Swedish heritage present at our Christmas celebrations after several generations. And I just thought it would be fun if we could record a little bit of that family history for the Kansas Voices Project. What are some of your memories from Christmases when you were a child?
Probably just a generation back, some of the similar things. My dad's side of the family was quite large. There were many aunts and uncles and cousins, and we used to like to have the big gatherings at the house at Christmas. And my dad's aunts and uncles were the children of Swedish immigrants. So they had memories of really the Swedish language and customs and everything, and yet they were born and raised Americans. But at Christmas, this humor and their memories came out a lot.
That's really cool. I really
Uh-huh.
like that. And this is a picture of some of those aunts and uncles.
Mm-hmm.
We'll just show that to the audience. In the middle is Josephine Johnson Forsberg Lundberg.
She was my great-grandmother, my dad's paternal grandmother, and I was always fascinated by her story. She apparently immigrated with her mother and her siblings on a ship from Sweden to America when she was only 12. There were a couple of other siblings, probably three others, and one sister became sick on the ship and died and was buried at sea. The story just always fascinated me so much with her life because it was a part of our lives. It wasn't some untouchable thing from the far distant past. It was very near us.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's really interesting to have an immigrant in the family, like you said, just a few generations back.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Josephine was my great-grandpa's mother.
Right.
And do you want to tell us a little bit more about his family?
You mean
Oscar's.
as Oscar?
As it relates to his mother.
Okay. He was one of the younger ones. She was married twice and raised 8 children. Her first husband, with whom she had 4 children, was killed in a mining accident. They lived someplace up in the Waterville area, so it must have been a gypsum mine. And here she was, a widow with 4 little children. I know that women didn't have many options back in those days, and probably no means of support.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how much later it was, she married Ed Lundberg, who was actually John Edward. And they had 4 more children. So she raised a family of 8 altogether.
That's amazing.
It was.
Amazing. So
I thought it was.
You had a lot of aunt and uncles at your your Christmases.
Yes.
Who all had Swedish roots. That's very, very cool. What are some of the things that you remember about visiting with Josephine when you were a youngster?
I don't remember a one-on-one conversation so much. I remember visiting at her house as a family with my parents and siblings. When my sister was born, my immediate family lived in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and we would make trips back occasionally. I do remember when my sister was a baby and we went down to visit great-grandma. And Mother put Catherine, my little sister, in great-grandma's lap, and Grandma asked what we had named the baby, and Mother said Catherine, and she said in her Swedish accent, "Ah, Catherine, that's a pretty name." And anytime she spoke it with her accent, it just fascinated me for some reason.
Mm-hmm. That's really neat. And this is another picture of Josephine,
Mm-hmm.
and she was just absolutely beautiful, even as an older lady. Now, she was also present at some of your big family Christmases, I'm assuming.
Yes, but the big family Christmases that I remember a lot, she was quite old because they would have been when I was in my early teens, before we had a place big enough for all of us to get together.
Right.
And by that time, she was in her mid to late 80s. So most of my memories of her are visiting at her house.
Mm-hmm. That's neat. And that was here in Manhattan.
Yes, it was.
On Yuma Street.
Mm-hmm.
Correct?
Mm-hmm.
And that is also where my grandpa, von Lundberg, was born. Correct?
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's very cool. Very cool. This is another picture of Josephine. And this is her husband, Ed Lundberg, correct?
Correct. And that's their wedding day. It struck me when I got the picture that she looked so young, and she always looked delicate to me. She was a small woman, and here she was already a widow with 4 little children.
Yeah.
On that day.
That's amazing. I mean, so many dramatic events happened so early in her life. To have come to America when she was 12,
right.
and then to have married and been widowed and have 4 children and then remarry. And all at such a young age.
Yes.
That had to have been very, very difficult life, you know.
Well, I would think so too, but so many of those people had the attitude that you do what you have to do. And that's just, you just go on.
That's true. Well, you didn't have much choice because survival was really something that people still had to work very hard at that time.
Yes, that's true.
So, let's see. Are there any other specific memories that you can think of that that you'd like to share about Josephine?
Okay. I do remember her house a bit. It was a small, white frame 2-story house. And in the flood of 1951, of course, it being in the lower part of town, it was flooded. And she had to stay someplace else, I imagine with probably one of her kids or something, until the flood receded and they got it all cleaned up. They had put, when they got everything dried out and re-wallpapered, they had put a mark on the wall where the floodwater had been. And it was just about my dad's height. And my dad was just under 6 feet tall.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's a lot of water.
And I remember as she got older, she could not thread her needle. She did, and I don't know what kind of sewing, but it was by hand. And someone, whether a neighbor or a relative or what, would come in to her home and thread needles for her with probably 4 or 5 feet of thread on them, knotted.
Oh my gosh.
And this row of needles stuck on her wall with this long thread hanging down so that she could sew. And when she was out of thread, someone had to come thread more needles for her.
That's very cool that you remember that, and that she had a hobby still and an occupation that she could do even if she couldn't see as well as she previously did.
I do also remember her kitchen stove. It was the green and cream enamel, like the antique stoves with the 4 gas burners on one side and the tall oven on the other side.
Oh,
and it was on high legs, and she always had a coffee pot there. Swedes always loved their coffee.
That I remember always when I stayed with Grandma and Grandpa when I was a child. Every morning, Grandma would get up and make Grandpa's lunch, and then she would make a big pot of coffee on the stove still,
Uh-huh.
even in
Mhm.
those days, and fill a big thermos for him so that he could take it to work with him.
Mhm.
So I think that carried through several generations of Lundbergs. So, and do you want to talk a little bit about kind of the family occupation, starting with Ed Lundberg, Josephine's husband?
Ed Lundberg was a bricklayer. My grandpa Oscar was a bricklayer. My uncle Ted, who was my grandpa's brother, another of Josephine's sons, may have started out as a bricklayer. I don't really remember. I do remember that he partnered with someone and formed a construction company that became quite large and successful.
Mm-hmm.
And they ran that company for many years. One of the sons was a postal worker, and one was a grocer. One son moved to California at a very young age, and I had heard his name. I never knew him as a person. I don't remember ever meeting him. But those occupations, along with printing, carried down through 3 or 4 generations.
Mm-hmm.
So many of them were either in construction work or in grocery work, or were printers or were postal workers.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the sons followed what their fathers had done.
Sure.
Mhm.
That makes sense. And in our line of the family, that was bricklaying,
Mhm.
obviously.
Yes.
And my grandpa, Von Lundberg, was a bricklayer, and his sons, Gary
Both of them.
and Jeff,
Mhm.
were bricklayers,
Mhm.
as well as grandpa's brothers. Correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
But one was a grocer.
Except for the one that was the grocer. That's right. I forgot about that. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yep. Uncle Mel.
Uh-huh.
So that's very cool. We're not sure what they did in Sweden, but it's really fascinating that when they came to America, they established occupations and carried them down through generations.
Mhm.
I think that's very interesting.
Mhm.
So, thank you very much for sharing
You're
this
welcome.
with me on video so that we can present it to the Kansas Voices History Project. And I love you.
I love you too.
Mwah.
I enjoyed it. Thanks.